The Emmy winner, best-selling author Sunny Hostin is here. Sunny, you recently interviewed the vice president. I have so much to get into with you, but I also have breaking news here, which is Kamala Harris speaking out in her first ever interview on Fox News, a big campaign event by any means. The interview's over. You cannot see any more of the interview in full at Fox. The interview's done. We're going to show you some of the key parts right now with Sunny Hostin to break it down. Here is the vice president facing off with Fox's Bret Baier over Donald Trump's public vows to abuse military power.
We asked that question to the former president today. Harris Faulkner had a town hall, and this is how he responded.
I heard about that. They were saying I was like threatening. I'm not threatening anybody. They're the ones doing the threatening. They do phony investigations. I've been investigated more than Alphonse Capone. He was the greatest gangster. No, it's true. No, but think of it. It's called weaponization of government. It's a terrible thing.
So,
Brett, I'm sorry, and with all due respect, that clip was not what he has been saying about the enemy within that he has repeated when he's speaking about the American people. That's not what you just showed.
Well, he was asked about that specific...
No, that's not what you just showed. In all fairness and respect to you...
that was the question that we asked him.
You didn't show that, and here's the bottom line. He has repeated it many times, and you and I both know that. And you and I both know that he has talked about turning the American military on the American people. He has talked about going after people who are engaged in peaceful protest. He has talked about locking people up because they disagree with him. This is a democracy. And in a democracy, the President of the United States, in the United States of America, should be willing to be able to handle criticism without saying he'd lock people up for doing it. And this is what is at stake, which is why you have someone like the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying what Mark Milley has said about Donald Trump being a threat to the United States of America.
An emphatic warning there. That's brand new sound. We're airing that for the first time here on MSNBC moments ago in her first ever interview on Fox News. Sunny Hostin is here. What was striking in that moment is that she didn't just take the selected clip or sound that for whatever reason they chose.
Misinformation.
Right? That sort of was a dodge to it, but reframed it back to what she says are very serious threats to abuse power. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, she was factual. And I'm actually surprised that they would play that clip. And I watched the entire interview in the green room. I had the pleasure of doing that. And what I saw is someone who loves this country, who is competent, who is fit to be the president of the United States, who is in complete command of the facts and understands the stakes and what that our democracy truly is at stake.
You've interviewed her recently.
Yes, I have.
I should mention, we're going to play this in a moment. Part of your interview was played within the Bret Baier interview to Kamala Harris. We'll get you on that. Very interesting. I was saying about Bob Woodward earlier tonight, we don't plan these things. Sometimes they just happen. Has she ever had an interview like this?
You know, people are saying that she went on Fox News. It's the first time that she has gone on Fox News, that she, you know, went into the belly of the beast and she went into enemy territory. I think that she did that because there are a group of people that have been fed over and over again misinformation and disinformation on Fox News. I mean, you have a court, you have a judge saying that it's entertainment and not facts and not news. And so I think it's important that she did that so that to help those people make a decision as to who is more fit to be the president of the United States. And I think her response in pointing out that key Republicans, people in his own cabinet, have said that he is not fit. And I'm a bit disappointed that what I saw, and this is not to disparage Bret Baier, because I've interviewed him too, and I know him well, and he's one of our colleagues, of course, in journalism. You know, he was a little bit dismissive. I think it's of that fact. I think it's very important when you have your own former vice president not endorse you.
Do you think that he approached her differently than other people he interviews?
You know, I saw a little bit of the panel after the interview, and one woman said that she came in hot, and also said that she became angrier. I thought he came in hot. And what I am very tired of is this trope of the angry black woman. She was not angry. She was in command of the facts. She was passionate. Passion does not equal anger. You know, I'm often called, you know, Donald Trump actually called me dumb at a rally recently. You have these tropes that are used against women and women of color in particular. And I did not see a dumb woman. I did not see an angry woman. I saw a woman who understands what is at stake. And I thought that she was very, very strong. And I hope people heard what she had to say, which is that Biden is not on the ballot. Kamala Harris is on the ballot. And what you have is a binary choice, Kamala Harris or someone who is unstable, as told by his own former staffers.
Well, and I appreciate exactly how you put it. People can listen to that and keep your points in mind. If there are people who are concerned about which of these two candidates is more angry, quote unquote, or more reckless, more of a vituperative, I can get my thesaurus out. There's a lot of documented evidence that he is the louder, angrier one. I want to play more from the Bret Baier interview. So this is the Bret Baier interview, which just aired. We have the moment I mentioned. Yeah. We're going to air this for the first time right now. This is Vice President Harris in the new interview. We've got the highlights. And at one point, we have Baier playing the recent interview you did with the Vice President. Let's take a look.
You were asked on 2 different shows last week what, if anything, you would do differently than President Biden. Here's what you said.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind.
Nothing comes to mind that you would do differently?
Let me be very clear. My presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency. And like every new president that comes into office, I will bring my life experiences, my professional experiences, and fresh and new ideas.
Sonny?
I'm surprised to see The View on Fox News. So, you know, I thank them for that, I guess. But she did answer my question. I asked what would be the difference between a Harris presidency and a Biden presidency. I think she's very loyal to President Biden. I think it's clear that the Biden administration has had one of the most successful administrations in history. She has nothing to be ashamed of having been part of that. She did ultimately answer my question and said that she would have a Republican in her cabinet, much like Abraham Lincoln did, much like Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote in Team of Rivals. And so I think that is a very different approach. She also said she would bring her lived experience to the presidency. They are 2 very different people.